So after Yakuza 0, I naturally wanted to start Yakuza Kiwami as soon as possible. After I finished it, I was hit with such a range of emotions that I didn't know how to process. Yakuza Kiwami is a remake of the original Yakuza from 2005 and was released internationally in 2017. Using the gameplay and style system of Yakuza 0, it recreates the story of the original game with updated visuals and mechanics, or at least that's the general idea. Did they succeed? Well, let's find out. Now, like I said before, I've never played the original version of Yakuza on the PS2, so if any story details are different, then I apologize. The story of Yakuza Kiwami starts off 7 years after the events in Yakuza 0, after Kiryu's made a name for himself in the Dojima family, to the point of trying to form his own family. However, things take a drastic turn when his sworn brother Nishiki murders their patriarch Sohei Dojima after he assaults their childhood friend Yumi. With Nishiki's sister in critical condition, Kiryu frames himself for Dojima's murder and is sent to prison for 10 years. After his release, Kiryu is thrown into a complete mess of a war involving the Yakuza, Chinese triads, street gangs, all revolving around a little girl named Haruka, as well as Nishiki, who doesn't seem to be the same man he was a decade ago. Now again, I don't want to say much about the story, as it's one of the game's biggest strengths, but also its biggest weakness, but I'll get to what I mean by that later on. Kiryu is the stoic, awesome Yakuza you knew and loved from Yakuza 0, although he seems to have lost a tiny bit of emotion since then, maybe it's just me. And the returning characters such as Majima are always a pleasure to hear. I mean, this guy just oozes with charm and personality, even more so now that he's reached his full mad dog of Shimano self. Haruka is an excellent character, and watching her relationship with Kiryu blossom over the course of the story is genuinely heartwarming stuff. Moving on to the presentation, the game looks pretty much as good as Yakuza 0, maybe a tiny bit better, but to be honest, I can't exactly tell. I'm not the best at judging visuals, admittedly, but I did find the game to be very visually appealing. Once again, the only real issue I have is some of the textures, as they just look a bit muddy and blurry, but the character models look excellent, and the cutscenes seem to be animated beat for beat as close to the original game as possible. Combat animations are excellent, and the voice acting is awesome as well, or it sounds good enough to me, since I don't speak Japanese. But hey, at least it's better than the English dub on the PS2. The soundtrack is once again amazing, with the remix of Funk Goes On probably being the most popular song in the whole game, and the karaoke tracks are excellent as well. Now getting into the gameplay. If you like the gameplay of Yakuza 0, you'll probably like Yakuza Kiwami, as the combat is almost exactly the same as the combat in Yakuza 0, with Kiryu rocking the same styles he had in the previous game, pretty much untouched from there. Brawler, Rush, Beast, and Dragon are back and packing a punch, although I gotta say that I found Beast style much weaker and Rush style to be much more powerful than in 0. I don't know if that's just the truth, or maybe it's just in my head, I don't know. The skill system has also been changed a bit to reflect the earlier games, but you don't use money to gain skills anymore, and instead Yakuza Kiwami has a traditional XP system. But all of that doesn't even begin to compare to the biggest change that Yakuza Kiwami brings to the table, Goro Majima. Kiwami introduces a system to the game called Majima Everywhere, and as it suggests, Majima is fucking everywhere in this game. He'll attack you from the most random places and for the most random reasons, but the main reason this gimmick exists is to build up Kiryu's Dragon of Dojima style. Having spent 10 years on the joint and becoming a fucking pussy, the dragon inside him has to grow again, so to speak, and you do that by fighting Majima, who's rocking the same styles he had in Yakuza 0. And all I'm gonna say is that if you thought fighting with Breaker style was fun in Yakuza 0, fighting it against here is a goddamn nightmare. That is until you unlock the Tiger Drop and essentially turn Majima into an XP farm. Now, this system is extremely controversial amongst the fanbase, but honestly, I love it for two main reasons. The first is that Majima is my favorite character in this whole series, and seeing him more often is never that big of an issue for me. And the second reason is that even if it was an issue, it wouldn't matter all that much because the combat is just so goddamn fun. Now, in terms of negatives with Yakuza Kiwami, I have two main big ones. The first is that while there are a few genuinely good and entertaining sub-stories in Kiwami, a lot of them aren't the best and feel more like filler to pad out an admittedly emptier feeling Kamurocho. The second big problem I have with the story, and like I said, I do love it, it's really only a story that seems to carry a lot of emotional weight if you've played Yakuza 0, because that's where a lot of the context for these characters being who they are comes to the forefront, and you understand why these scenes are a lot more heartbreaking and emotional than they would be if you didn't play the previous game. Overall, I considered Yakuza Kiwami to be an extremely solid game. As for it being a better version of the original, I can't say, but I can say that as a follow-up to Yakuza 0, this game gave me so much enjoyment and fun that it makes it an easy recommendation for me. Now here's where I'm probably going to end up upsetting a lot of people, but the follow-up, Yakuza Kiwami 2, wasn't exactly what I'd hoped it would be. But before I get into the problems I have with this one, let's just start with a summary. Yakuza Kiwami 2 is a remake of Yakuza 2 from 2006 and was released in 2017 initially and internationally in 2018, utilizing the Dragon engine which was used to create Yakuza 6 The Song of Life. Did they succeed in bringing Yakuza 2 into the modern age? In my opinion, yes and no. The story of Yakuza Kiwami takes place in 2006, 1 year after the first game, as Kiryu has essentially accepted his role as Haruka's adopted father, wanting to leave the Tojo clan behind when he's dragged back into the Yakuza business after a failed attempt to kill him, causing him to travel to Sotenbori in order to seek out Daigo Dojima, Sohei's son, and hopefully bring the Tojo clan to the top again as they're at war with the Omi Alliance, led by a man named Ryuji Goda, who wants to defeat Kiryu and claim his title as the one true dragon. The story of Yakuza 2 is certainly engaging, and while there's a lot going on, it's pretty easy to follow. That is, until near the end, when logic gets thrown out the fucking window and the story gets so damn hard to keep track of that it's not even funny. While I did get tired of the plot near the end, the one thing I never got tired of was Ryuji Goda. I mean, this man steals every scene he's in and makes Nishiki look like a bitch in comparison. That being said, the plot didn't really grab me as much as the first game, but it did keep me engaged until the end. Getting into the presentation, this is where I have some issues. Yakuza Kiwami 2, as I stated before, runs on the Dragon engine, and while the game itself does look gorgeous, it only runs at 30 frames per second or slower, which is a massive pain in the ass. In combat, this can massively mess me up, and on top of that, I encountered a lot of instances of the game just either freezing up or something similar, and I can't think of any other game in the series that did this for me. What I'll say is that if you're going to play this game, play it on PC, as the extra frames will do you justice. Trust me on that. Aside from that, the sound design is just as good as ever, with the Sotenbori battle theme being an exceptional highlight, as well as the instantly recognizable Majima construction anthem. Now we get to the gameplay, and I do not want to sugarcoat things, people. I despise this combat. Mostly due to the 30 FPS issue I mentioned earlier, but also due to a massive issue with most of the Dragon Engine games, block bouncing, which is a game mechanic I cannot fucking stand because it breaks the flow of combat to an exponential degree, and it's just not fun to have your combos from your one combat style interrupted by some dick putting his arm up and blocking your foot. Yeah, you heard me right. You only have one style in this game, and while you can beef it up to be powerful as hell, I don't know why they didn't put styles in this game. You do sort of have beast mode with this extreme heat mode thing, but why they didn't re-implement styles after Yakuza 6's combat was criticized for not having it is beyond me. And given that the Judgment games later added styles back as a mechanic, it makes me so damn confused as to why they didn't just do it here. It just limits the creativity made possible by the mechanic of multiple different playstyles. Thank God this was the last Dragon Engine game to limit players to one style. As for the rest of the gameplay, it's pretty simple. You've got the D-pad mapped to weapons instead of the styles, the return of the Cabaret Club management minigame from Yakuza 0, practically unchanged, and Majima Construction, which is a tower defense sort of mode that, while fun, isn't really my cup of tea. Although I will say that Majima is a complete nut in this game, and I do love him for that. Speaking of Majima, there's actually a small set of chapters called the Majima Saga in which you play as him in between the events of Yakuza 1 and 2, sort of bridging the gap between the two games as well as essentially finishing his and Makoto Makimoto's story. That being said, aside from the story, these chapters, aside from being painfully short, are also painfully average, and your only means of combat is Majima's Mad Dog style, which is a pitifully weaker version compared to Yakuza 0 and Kiwami 1. Overall, I gotta say, out of all of the Dragon Engine games, Yakuza Kiwami 2 is by far my least favorite, and it's also one of my least favorite games in the series, but that's not to say it's bad. It's a very enjoyable action game that looks gorgeous and has a ton of great side quests, but that combat and the platform I played it on unfortunately hampered my experience by a considerable margin, and I can't help but feel like if I had played this on PC or with an FPS boost on Xbox Series X, it would have mattered a ton in making my playtime feel better, but unfortunately I didn't, and in my honest opinion, Yakuza Kiwami 1 was a much more enjoyable time for me.